The First Year, Part 4. It was growing late in the fall. The nights were frosty and soon the ground would freeze. The breaking of the new 50-acre field was nearly finished. There was no Sunday afternoon drives now. Skip and Barnum were working too hard at the plowing to be driven. They must have their day of rest. Instead, there were long horseback rides, for Manly had a saddle pony of his own, and Fly and Trixie, having nothing else to do, were always ready to go. Laura and Trixie had learned to foxtrot and to lope together. The little short lope would land them from the side of the road across the wheel track onto the grass-covered middle. Another jump would cross the other wheel track. Trixie would light so springingly on her dainty feet that there was never a jar. One day as they were loping down a road, Manly said, "Oh yes, Trixie can jump short and quick, but Fly can run away from her." And Fly started. Laura bent low over Trixie's neck, touched her with her whip, and imitated as near as she could manage a cowboy yell. Trixie shot ahead like a streak, leaving Fly behind. Laura stopped her and sat a little breathless until Manly came up. But when Manly protested at the sudden start, she said airily, "Oh, Trixie told me she was going in plenty of time." After that, it was proven many times that Trixie was faster, often on a 20-mile ride over open prairie before breakfast. It was a carefree, happy time, for two people thoroughly in sympathy can do pretty much as they like. To be sure, now and then Laura thought about the short crop and wondered. Once she even saved the cream carefully and sent a jar of fresh butter to town for sale, thinking it would help pay for the groceries Manly was getting. With the butter, she sent 5 dozen eggs, for the little flock of hens picking their living around the barn and the straw stacks and in the fields were laying wonderfully well. But Manly brought the butter back. Not a store in town wanted it at any price, and he had been able to get only 5 cents a dozen for the eggs. Laura couldn't help in any way, but why worry? Manly didn't. When the breaking was finished, the hay barn back of the house was made more snug for winter. It was a warm place for the stock, with hay stacked tightly on each side against the skeleton frame. Hay was stacked even over the roof, about 4 feet thick at the eaves and a little thicker at the peak of the roof to give plenty of slant to shed water. With a long hay knife, Manny had cut 2 holes through the haystack on the south side of the barn. Then he had put windows over the holes inside the barn, for, he said, the stock must have light even with the door shut. When the barn was made snug, it was butchering time. But old Larson, the neighbor across the road, butchered first. Mr. Larson was always borrowing. It was the cause of disagreement between Manly and Laura, for Laura objected to tools and machinery being used and broken and not returned. When she saw Manly going afoot to the back end of old Larson's field to get some machine that should have been in his own barn, she was angry, but Manly said one must be neighborly. So when Mr. Larson came over to borrow the large barrel in which to scald his hog in the butchering, she told him to take it. Manly was in town, but she knew he would lend it. In a few minutes, Mr. Larson came back to borrow her wash boiler to heat the water to scald the hog. Soon he was back again to borrow her butcher knives for the work, and again a little later for her knife whetstone to sharpen the knives. Grimly, Laura said to herself, if he came next to borrow their fat hog to kill, she would let him have it, but he had a hog of his own. And after that, he did not bring over a bit of fresh meat, as good neighbors always did. A few days later, Manly butchered his fat hog, and Laura had her first experience in making sausage, head cheese, and lard all by herself. Hams and shoulders and spare ribs were frozen in the storm shed, and fat meat was salted down in a small barrel. Laura found doing work alone very different from helping Ma, but it was part of her job and she must do it, though she did hate the smell of hot lard, and the sight of so much fresh meat ruined her appetite for any of it. It was at this time the directors of the school were able to pay Laura the salary for the last month she had taught. The money made Laura feel quite rich, and she began planning how she should spend it. Manly told her if she bought a colt, with it she could double her money in a short time by selling it when it was grown. So that was what they decided to do, and Manly bought a bay 2-year-old that promised to grow out well. Laura didn't bother to name the colt. It was just to be sold again, so what was the use? But the animal was fed well, brushed and cared for to make it grow well. One blustery day, Manly started early for town, leaving Laura very much alone. She was used to being the only person on the place and thought nothing of it, but the wind was so cold and raw that she had not opened the front door. It was still locked from the night in the middle of the morning. Busy with her hard work, Laura looked out the window and saw a little bunch of horsemen coming across the prairie from the southeast. She wondered why they were not traveling on the road. As they came nearer, she saw there were 5 of them, and they were Indians. Laura had seen Indians often without fear, but she felt a quick jump of her heart as they came up to the house and without knocking tried to open the front door. She was glad the door was locked, and she slipped quickly into the back room and locked the outside door there. The Indians came around the house to the back door and tried to open that. Then, seeing Laura through the window, they made signs for her to open the door, indicating they would not hurt her. But Laura shook her head and told them to go away. Likely they only wanted something to eat, but still never one could tell. It was only 3 years ago that the Indians nearly went on the warpath a little way west, and even now they often threaten the railroad camps. She wouldn't open the door, but watched them as they jabbered together. She couldn't catch a word that she could understand, and she was afraid. They weren't acting right. Why didn't they go away? Instead, they were going to the barn, and her new saddle was hanging in the barn, and Trixie was there. Trixie, her pet and comrade. Laura was afraid. In the house there was comparative safety, for they'd hardly break in. But now Laura was angry too, and as always she acted quickly. Flinging the door open, she ran to the barn, and standing in the door, ordered the Indians out. One of them was feeling the leather of her beautiful saddle, and one was in the stall with Trixie. Trixie was afraid too. She never liked strangers, and she was pulling at her halter and trembling. The other Indians were examining Manly's saddle and the buggy harness with its bright nickel trimmings. But they all came and gathered around Laura just outside the door. She stormed at them and stamped her foot. Her head was bare, and her long brown braids of hair blew out on the wind, while her purple eyes flashed fire, as always when she was angry or very much excited. The Indians only stared for a moment, and then one of them grunted an unintelligible word and laid his hand on Laura's arm. Quick as a flash, she slapped his face with all her might. It made him angry, and he started toward her. But the other Indians laughed, and one who seemed to be the leader stopped him. Then, with signs pointing to himself, his pony, and then with a sweep of his arm toward the west, he said, "You go. Me. Be my squaw?" Laura shook her head and, stamping her foot again, motioned them all to their ponies and away, telling them to go. And they went, riding ponies without saddles or bridles. But as they went, their leader turned and looked back at Laura where she stood, with the wind blowing her skirts around her and her braids flying, watching them go away across the prairie into the west.